Amen. Like many of you in the room, I see an optometrist, and I haven't seen my doctor in a few years, so back in February I made the call to set up for an appointment. Well, they were very busy, and there's been a lot of shuffling with staff and the like, and so they kept on kicking the can down the road in terms of setting up an appointment. And finally it was July, and I call again, and I ask, I wanted to set something up, and they said, yeah, we have a couple of new doctors. Do you mind seeing somebody different when you come in for your visit? I said, no, not a problem. I don't have any major eye issues. I just wanted a quick exam, make sure things are going okay. And so we set something up, and this past week I walk into the doctor's office. And I stroll in there. Now, I've been going to the same doctor for 23 years now. And I walk in the office, and it's early in the morning, and I didn't recognize anybody. I didn't the receptionist, the person doing the billing, and I'm okay, this is fine. So they knew who I was, so they checked me in, and I sit down, and then all of a sudden some woman about 2 minutes later comes out and calls me back, and I'm like, well, who are you? And we sit down, and no introduction. I had no idea who this person was. I'm like, are you the doctor? Are you a tech? Or nurse? Who are you? And I'm just sitting there, and she asks me a bunch of questions, and then just leaves. And I'm like, all right, well, maybe she's coming back. Maybe she is, and I'm just kind of in this state of, confusion and a little wondering what's going to come next. And then there's a knock on the door, and this other woman comes in, and she's like, well, I'm the doctor. I was like, oh, okay, that gave me a little bit of relief. At least I now have some sort of an identity here. And we get to talking a bit, and it turns out she actually went to a medical school that I was familiar with. And my nerves sort of calmed down because I got to know this doctor just a little bit. And the same idea here holds true with our walk with God. We get unnerved in life. Let's face it. You go through your day, and you got problems, you got people to deal with, you got finances, and you're always getting hit with a curveball in life. You think the project that you're starting is going to take a week, and it takes 2 months. The person you thought was going to show up for work doesn't. Your car breaks down. I mean, the list just goes on, and we go through this all the time, and we find that as we're walking with God, the more we know who He is, the easier it is to relate to Him and to find comfort in Him and to draw courage as we face an uncertain world. The miracle study here we've been looking at in John's Gospel opens with Lazarus. He's sick, and Jesus says this is for the glory of God, but we also find that the story is not just about Lazarus. It's going to involve, the disciples. We see that in the course of Jesus' discourse with a couple of them, He explains that, this has happened so that you may believe. So there's a spiritual issue. There's a faith matter at hand here. And now we find that the story starts to snowball as we move into the second section here. Lazarus has passed away. Jesus has not been on the scene. You can't imagine the disappointment Martha and Mary must have had because they call upon Jesus, they seek after Him, and He doesn't show up. And now there's frustration, there's mourning, there's death. There's a huge crowd that's coming to visit with Martha and Mary, and that's where we pick up the story because Lazarus has now been buried, and Jesus, finally decides to come and visit the sisters. And we see here in John 11:17, the story continues when it says this. So when Jesus came, He found that He had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet Him, but Mary stayed at home. Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha said to Him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to Him, yes. Lord, I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world." When she had said this, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, "The teacher is here, and he's calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus wept. So the Jews were saying, "See how he loved him." And some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man also from dying?" And we'll stop right there. We have two conversations and an application. We open here with the funeral. And this is where, Lazarus has been buried, but we're still in that funeral week, that time of mourning and grieving. And as soon as Martha runs to Jesus, "Hey, you were late. And had you been here, things would have been different." I mean, that's what she's saying in the vernacular. She's upset. And I can't imagine what she must have been going through, because you think about it, these people had direct contact with Christ. They saw the miracles. They saw the work. They saw the power. They saw the crowds. They saw this evidence of God moving in ways that no one else in human history has ever had the opportunity to see. And here they are witnessing to this, and Jesus doesn't show up. You want to talk about, a huge disappointment. But they're struggling with this. They don't seem to be angry or upset, but there's definitely this struggling. And they're going through what we would call the funeral process in Jewish custom. When somebody died back then, they went through a series of rituals. Prior to the first century, it was actually very extensive. It was very expensive, believe it or not. And they sort of scaled things back by the first century. Rabbi Gamaliel kind of set the stage, if you would, for what they did. And we come on the scene, and they're actually following through what the rabbinical tradition had entailed. There was a preparation of the body. They would wash a person within just minutes after passing away. They would anoint the person with spices and perfumes, depending on how much money you had. If you had very little, obviously you couldn't do much. If you had a lot more, you would use several pounds, up to 75 pounds of different spices to prepare the body for burial. They would wrap them in like linen strips, sort of like a mummy, and that was called the grave dress. And they would prepare the body, and then they would actually carry the body. There would be a procession to either a cemetery, a mass grave, which was common for those who didn't have the means of affording a personal a tomb, or if you had the money, you had a personal tomb. They didn't have graveyards like we have today, unless you had a lot of caves together, in which case you may have multiple tombs in a hillside. And so they would go through, and they would have a procession, and the word would get out very quickly. The minute somebody passed away, the word would spread, and people would flock. And that was part of Gamaliel's exhortation to the Jewish nation, that being a moral, upright Jew involved comforting those who are bereaving. So that's why there's a crowd here. It's very similar to John chapter 9, when we have the story of the blind man. It's not just about a blind man, struggling with this condition. There's this crowd that comes in, and the entire populace starts to swell around the situation, and that's precisely what's happening here once again. There's more people involved in this than just Mary and Martha and Lazarus. the disciples, and now we see all these folk coming out from Jerusalem. So they would actually carry the body to the gravesite, whether it be a tomb or the mass burial site. And at that place, there would be a procession. If you could afford it, you'd have professional mourners. People would dressed in black. They would come out. They'd weep and wail and make a big fuss. I mean, they really made a racket. If you could get a musician in there, that'd even be better. And sometimes they'd play harps and flutes and dirges and the like. And it was really quite the scene. When you got to the gravesite, there would be a eulogy. People would speak, just like we do in funerals today. Folk would get up and say this and that about the person and reflect upon the deceased. And then there would be a procession back to the home, and they would have a meal. They would sit down and eat. And this would go on. Sometimes the grieving process was 7 days. It could go up to a year. It depended on your relationship with the person who passed away. So we're now in what we would call the comforting reception portion of the funeral, whereby lots and lots of people were coming out to visit with Martha and Mary to console them. That's when Jesus shows up. Very unique. The timing is impeccable. On God's timetable, Mary and Martha are probably disputing that. But Mary now poses the question here. Had you been here, things would have been good. And Jesus responds back and mentions the resurrection. Now that's a unique thing to say, because there were certain Jews who did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. There's others who did. And Martha made reference and mentioned that she does believe that there could be a resurrection. And she's bringing us back to our call to worship. We find the idea of resurrection as far back as the book of Job. And it tells us in Job 19:25, "As for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will take his stand on the earth. Even after my skin has been destroyed." Here's this idea. "Yet for my flesh I shall see God, whom I myself shall behold, and whom my eyes will see, and not another. My heart is faint within me." So this idea of resurrection goes way back to the beginning of the Jewish history here, and with this person named Job. But what Jesus goes on to say after this is absolutely stunning. And this is where we see the first of two revelations in the passage. He says, and this is the fifth great I am statement in John's Gospel. He says, "I am the resurrection and the life." Imagine a coin. A coin has what? Two sides to it. Heads and tails. Jesus, in that one statement, is like putting out a coin. Two sides to a truth that will resonate for the rest of eternity. He said, "I am" what? The resurrection. Now, the idea of resurrection requires, there's a requisite that goes before it. In order for something to be resurrected, it must die. You follow with me? Resurrection requires death. If something is going to be resurrected, then there must be something that leads into this. And what he is pointing to is really two things simultaneously: his own death and resurrection, and our death and resurrection. Death is always associated in the Scriptures with sin. The wages of sin is what? Death. To die is to be separated. When someone dies, when something dies, it is separated. Separation with God, separation from others, separation within. So whenever someone sins, there's a threefold sense of separation that occurs. Our relationship with God dies, our relationship with others die, our relationship within begins to crumble. We fall apart internally. Think about it in this light. When somebody goes out and is selfish, what happens to their relationships around them? They fall apart. If somebody is angry, if they have an axe to grind, what happens? Relationships fall apart. You say something nasty to a person, if you're rude, relationships fall apart. They die slowly, but they begin to disintegrate. This is what happens. And what we find here is Jesus is proclaiming, "I am the resurrection." I'm going to do something here that involves taking that which is dead and bringing it back to what? The other side of the coin. To life. to live is to be enjoined and connected with God. It tells us right in the beginning of John's Gospel. It says that Jesus is what? He was the light and the life of men. And this motif is woven through the entire fabric of John's Gospel. Light and life. To be connected with God meant that one would have life. To be disconnected would be that idea of death. Listen to what we see here, a beautiful picture that's painted later on in the Gospel of John. Oops, wrong one. Got to go backwards here. Jesus said to his disciples in the upper room discourse, he said, I am the vine, and you're what? The branches. If a person remains in him, he will bear fruit. But if we don't remain in him, and this is a picture of grafting here, we're like a dead branch that's thrown away and withers and dies. And he uses this picture here of a vine and a branch to illustrate this idea of resurrection and bringing life back to something which is dead. I lived near an orchard years ago as a boy, and the fellow who owned this orchard, he would graft branches into various apple trees. And he had a variety of different apples growing from the same tree. And he would cut a branch, he would take another branch off of a different tree, he would slice it a very special way, and he would literally create a wedge and insert the branch in, and then wrap that in there. And that branch, which would be considered dead by all practical purposes, in time bore fruit and would blossom and would grow and flourish. And that is the picture here of resurrection. This is exactly what Jesus is trying to convey. He will bring that life into someone's life if we turn to Him. And then he poses, this is how it happens. He doesn't just leave us with this statement. He now explains what one must do. And he says, whoever believes in me will never die. He brings in the component of faith. The righteous will live by faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And then he poses the question back to Martha, do you believe this? And she makes this beautiful profession of faith. She says this, I believe that you're the Christ. She sees He's Messiah. Number one. Number two, she says, I also believe that you are the Son of God. And she professes His deity. She goes on to say this, who was to come into the world. Notice the connection with Job, the one who's going to stand, who you're going to see. There's going to be this visual. Who is to come into the world. She now acknowledges His humanity. A phenomenal profession of faith this woman makes right there. She understands something about Jesus. A critical set of truths that will help her in her relationship with Him. Why is this so important? Because if we don't realize that God has the means to do exactly what He has told us He's going to do, we'll never trust Him, we'll never follow Him. I'll give you a quick illustration. 2 days before our semester in college was about to end, we were in finals week, and it was like right at the tail, and we just had finished our finals at Susquehanna. Used to be in the morning. We'd have afternoons off to study, and then you'd have finals in the morning, and then you'd be done. It was a Thursday. Finals were going to be done on Friday. All of us get through with our tests. I'm walking to the cafeteria, and a buddy of mine comes up to me and says, hey, you want to go to lunch? And I'm like, well, let's go up to the cafeteria. He's like, no, let's go downtown. And there was a really nice restaurant downtown. I mean, it was expensive, great food. And he wanted to go down and eat down there. And I'm like, buddy, I can't. I don't even think I have enough money to get gas to go home. The end of the semester, if you've ever been in school, you're normally, you're scraping around for quarters just to have enough to, fill up your tank and make it down the road a few miles. So so I kind of declined with this guy because I didn't have 2 nickels in my pocket. And I was just hoping to have, the $20 that I did have would get me back home. And he's like, no, I'll take care of it. I was like, you sure? I mean, everybody was tapped out at this point. He's like, no, don't worry about it. He said, my father's the president of a pharmaceutical down in San Antonio. I got it covered. And I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. I'll have prime rib. And but that piece of information changed everything in my conversation. That one sentence, that one fact, that knowledge that was conveyed to me told me what? This dude has the means to take care of lunch. And I felt more than comfortable going out to dinner with him that day. What is Jesus conveying to us? He has the means to fulfill the promises that are being made. And that's where we find our first point. Jesus revealed His full divinity. He has the means to help. An absolutely critical piece of information in our relationship with God. His full divinity is being disclosed right here in this conversation. He has the means to help. Number 1. Number 2, he goes on. Martha takes off. Mary comes to visit. Conversation very familiar. If you had been here, Lazarus would be okay, and Jesus meets with him. And now notice the crowds are coming. More of them. The numbers are swelling. This conversation is not personal and private. This is happening in front of quite a few people. And Jesus reacted in a very unique way. I want to bring your attention to a couple of verses here. Verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her, He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. That idea of being deeply moved in spirit in Greek literally means to snort like a horse. To be so upset. To be agitated. To be stirred. To be really upset. You've seen people like this. You've walked into the store, maybe hopefully not in church, but it happens. You'll see somebody walking down the street and they look like they're ready to rip somebody's head off. And you're like, what's up with that? They're mad. And their countenance tells you everything. And we see Jesus in this burst of emotion, this snort, this stirring. It says He is troubled. That's a groan. It tells us in the book of Romans. In the same way, the Spirit also helps our weaknesses, for we do not know how to pray as we should, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. I went into a hospital once to visit a man who was dying. He was lying in the bed and he was groaning. He was writhing in pain. He was so moved. This is what Jesus is doing. He asks this question, where have they put Lazarus? And then we come to the shortest verse in the entire Bible. Verse 35. 2 words. Jesus wept. The idea of crying, there's lots of words for crying. And this one is very unique. It's not a burst. It's not like a wail or anything like that. It's a deep-seated weeping that just captures the soul, and it produces this flood of tears. Jeremiah said, rivers of tears flow from my eyes because they do not keep your law. And we find Jesus is agitated, he's groaning, and he's crying in the presence of these people. And the humanity of Christ emerges in a way that boggles the mind. He's feeling the pain alongside these dear people he loved. Scholars have asked, why was Jesus crying? Was it because of the sisters? Was it because of the crowd? One suggestion is this, that he was so moved by humanity's plight and sin. He was so upset over the struggle and the brokenness of this creation that he had designed. He put it together. He orchestrated it. He was there at the beginning. He set the whole world into motion. He watched over and carefully crafted people and events and time and space and all sorts of developments in humanity's history. And he's looking at this thing, and he's standing there in front of all these people. And I believe it just hits him. This place is a mess. It's a disaster. And sin is just running ravaged and rampant and roughshod through this creation that's good and beautiful. And he's just broken over it. It tells us in the book of Hebrews, for we do not have a high priest, this is a reference to Jesus, who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. And this is the beauty. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. He knows what it is like to be you, more than you probably even think and imagine. He knows your fears. He understands them perfectly. He knows the temptations that you're struggling with. He understands every element of how you wrestle in ways that no one else in this room could even comprehend. Because every one of you in this room, and I'm in this group as well, every one of us, there's a side of us that the world sees, and then there's a side of us that no one knows. We never let it out. We never disclose it. But it's there. There's hopes. There's dreams. There's struggles. And Jesus recognizes everyone and can identify with us on a level that no one else can. There's an old story of a Jew who was in a concentration camp during World War II. And his job was to dig the graves for his fellow Jews who had been executed in the gas chambers. And he's down in this muddy hole by stinking bodies, digging. And a guard comes by and looks at him down there in that hole. And he says to him, "Where's your God now?" And the Jewish man looks up at the guard and he says, "He's right here in the mud with me." He is a God who walks with us, who understands the human plight, who understands what it's like to struggle and be human. And this is why we see our second point. Jesus revealed his full humanity. He has the motive to help. Not just the means, but the motive to step in and be involved. Why is this so important? Number one, Jesus has the capacity and Jesus has the compassion. It's just that simple. The more we learn about the person of Christ through these miracles, the more we realize that Jesus is more than capable of carrying us through our trials and our tribulations, because He's God. And He's also fully human, and He has the compassion to connect with you and me. And that brings about a calm and a peace that transcends all understanding. There's a group of Boy Scouts years ago who were hiking up on the Appalachian Trail, very difficult part of the trail, very rugged, tough terrain. They were going to be out there for a few days. And they got dropped off at this one point, and most of the scouts were experienced hikers and were quite capable of making it up the mountain and working their way through to the campsite. But there was one guy in the group, he was a younger scout, little. He obviously had some problems to start. His pack wasn't the right type. It was overloaded with things he didn't need. It was a little busted. He didn't have the right shoes. He didn't have the right equipment. And he was terribly slow. And he was kind of limping along as the trail started. And one of the scoutmasters picked up on it immediately and realized that this kid is in trouble. So he pulls him aside and he takes his pack and he puts it back together again. He repairs some of the broken parts of the backpack, redistributes the weight, realizes he's got all his extra stuff, so he takes some of the load and he puts it in his own pack. And for the next 3 days, he hikes with this young scout behind the rest of them, because they were all up on the mountain already. And he just walked with them. And he encouraged him. And he pushed him up a few rocks. He checked his feet at night to make sure there weren't any blisters. And he was just by his side during the entire arduous task of making it from point A to point B. And that is a picture of the God who walks with us. The God who walked into this room this morning as we came to worship, who's going to walk out with you the minute you leave, is a God who comes by our side and says, share the load. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I'm going to give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle of spirit and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my burden is easy and my yoke is light. He walks with us. He carries us. He comforts us because He's capable and He is compassionate. Let's pray.